Hey everyone, how are we doing today? Welcome back to another episode of a novel review book podcast. If this is your first time joining, my name is Seamus and I run the episodes. Basically every week I explore a different book. I talk about a few different things through the episode, but basically it focuses around one central book, and throughout the episodes I do different things. I'm doing a book world tour where I explore the world through books, and every month I also read a fantasy book, which is what we're doing today. So today is part 2 of the Gormenghast trilogy. The book itself is called Gormenghast by Mervyn Peake. Really nice book, really keen to get into that. But first, I just wanted to check how we're doing. How is everyone? I hope we're all well. It is a very wet, cold, blustery February Saturday morning here in London. Got a nice cup of tea here. Hopefully you've also got a cup of tea, coffee, maybe something stronger if that's your tipple, and a nice book to read as well. So I hope we're all doing well. And yeah, let's get on with the show. First, I do want to say if you would like to like and subscribe, I'd greatly appreciate that. If you would like to hit 5 stars, if you're listening to this through more traditional podcast means, I'd also really greatly appreciate that. Comment, like, subscribe. If you've got some recommendations, chuck them in the comments, whatever. Send me an email. Doesn't matter. I will check them all. Thank you so much. And yeah, let's get on with the show. Okay, today I am talking about Mervyn Peake's Gormenghast. I might actually need to put my tea down. Mervyn Peake's Gormenghast. Fantastic book, 500 pages long, really, really nice. Part 2 in the Gormenghast trilogy. There is 3 books. I did the first one last month, which was Titus Grown, and I was really interested about this book, actually. I was really interested to see what was going to happen in this book because go and watch that episode, but I'd say quite famously, perhaps, there's not a whole lot that happens in the books. If you are looking for a sort of plot-driven story, these probably aren't the books for you. They are very dense books in the way that they're told. They're very embellished and colourful, and the depth of the language is really what you're reading these books for. So if you're looking for a plot-driven story, this might not be the one for you. That being said, there is still a plot, but the point of that was the first book, there was very much like not so much plot, and it was just this insane, beautiful world building and telling of this it's quite a dark story it tells, but it's just kind of told through this elongated structure, another 500-page book. And it's completely ephemeral, it's completely fantastical, it's completely beautiful. And so I guess coming into this book, I was quite interested to see how this story was going to be told, because as much as I loved the first one, and I absolutely loved the first one, I don't think I want to just read that part 2. Exactly the same kind of story, part 2. You want to see something different because the first one kind of has that ethereal, magical beauty of it being the first one, and I haven't seen any other books quite like it. So if he was just to come in, rehash that book for part 2, it would have been quite disappointing. That being said, this book is, I'd say, quite different enough to make it very much worthwhile. I'd say this book is even better to a degree for different reasons. I can get into that in a bit. But first, I sort of had a thought, and I was thinking about that kind of, how is this book going to hold up against the first book? And I was kind of thinking about how we always seem to, and I don't know why this is, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, we always seem to judge trilogies in a different way that we judge other things. So we always think about, is it better than the first? Everyone always says, no, the first one's better. The second one's just like a copy in some way. It's never as good. The first is always the best. And I was kind of thinking about that, and I was like, it's interesting because that only really seems to apply to trilogies. We always compare them in that manner in a trilogy, and I don't know why that is, because no one's going, oh, the second Harry Potter was better than the first Harry Potter. Yeah, well, like there's enough Harry Potters that everyone can have a varied opinion. Same with like James Bond's, the Marvel series, all these like series of things, it sort of like loses that appeal. But when it's a trilogy, it's always like, oh, the second one wasn't as good as the first one, and it's like a huge sticking point for a lot of people. So I kind of was thinking about that. I have no answers for it. But in the context, I'd say they're 2 incredibly different stories. I think it's obviously not as good as the first one in the sense that the first one was just completely new and completely fresh, and the writing style is, I've never seen anything like it. I think Peake's writing style is just unmatched at this stage in my reading career. If I come across something else, I'll let you know, but I think it's very much unmatched, and it's very much a distinct voice that is absolutely carrying these stories. So of course, the first one just has that magic of being completely new and fresh. The second one obviously still has the same writing style because it's still Peake writing it, but the story is different. So it's not the same, it's very different, but it's still just as magical, still just as fantastic. And like I said, I think it's probably a better story as well. So let's get into it. This is still an imaginative feast. The first one, I've got my notes here. The first book was very much this kind of magic artistry book, whereas this one is more a gothic feast. And that's sort of what I was talking about when I was worried about what this book was going to be like. I was very much put to rest within the first paragraph, because the first book seems kind of fun, I guess, even though there are some darker themes threading throughout it. I think the whole caravansary of the novel just feels incredibly fun. I don't even know if caravansary is the right word to use there, but it just sounded quite nice. But it seems this kind of like fun, really lighthearted circus kind of ridiculous story going on, ferried along by this beautiful artistry of language. And then so coming into the second one, like I said, I was kind of nervous. And then I read the first paragraph, and I'm going to read it for you here to show you sort of this book does take a bit of a darker turn, and I think you can get that sense right from the get-go. So here's the quote. Titus is 7, his confines Gormenghast, suckled on shadows, weaned as it were on webs of ritual. For his ears echoes, for his eyes a labyrinth of stone, and yet within his body something other than this unumbrageous legacy. For first and ever foremost, he is a child. A ritual more compelling than ever man devised is fighting anchored darkness. A ritual of the blood, of the jumping blood. These quicks of sentience owe nothing to his forebears, but to those feckless hosts a trillion deep of the globe's childhood. The gift of the bright blood, of blood that laughs when the tenets mutter, weep. Of blood that mourns when the seer laws croak, rejoice. O little revolution in great shades. End quote. So you can see there the language is just completely unmatched. Like I've never read anything like it. It is just so lyrically beautiful and dense. And I mean, the repetition of blood in this paragraph just kind of really highlights that this is a completely different story to the first one. This is going to be a darker story as well. Titus has grown up now to a bit. I mean, he's 7 in this. I think he's 17 towards the end of the story. So it covers a hefty chunk of time. But this story is going to be completely different. You know, there's something brooding. Titus is uncomfortable in his life. He is not particularly happy with these rituals that sort of hang over him day to day. And it's just going to be sort of a much darker story, of which it is. So I think it's time to probably do an overview, even though I think an overview is almost kind of ridiculous for a story like this, where the storyline is not the driving force of the story. But still, like it says, Titus is 7. And as it says there as well, he's first and ever foremost a child. And so a child wants to explore, and basically he's the earl. He's the king of this vast kingdom of Gormenghast. And what he wants to do basically is just explore it. He wants to be a kid. He wants to roam these halls, but instead he's sort of bound by these almost meaningless, well, to him they are meaningless rituals, because he doesn't quite comprehend them. He doesn't comprehend the sort of history of the world. And I think that's sort of a telling thing in a lot of children. They don't understand the history of the world because they don't have their own history to contend with, and to understand that the world has a past as they have their own past, because they don't actually have that past yet to grasp to. So he's just a kid. He wants to get out. He's sick of these rituals taking place. That's sort of going on. The main villain from the first story, Steerpike, is still climbing this ladder of trying to gain power within Gormenghast. He wants to rule Gormenghast. He's come from a lowly position and is trying to climb the ladder, but it's almost comical in a way, because there's so much ritual embedded within this story that it's actually really difficult for him to climb the ladder in a way that abides within the laws of ritual, which I think is very interesting, because he has to utilize these laws to his advantage, but he also wants to bring the laws down. So it's kind of all that going on as well. It's a really fantastic story. I think I need to get into a bit of detail. I think where this novel sort of really, and I think where Mervyn Peake really excels, is his writing style. And I mean, it is a 500-page book, and the first one's 500 pages as well. And like I said, not a lot happens in terms of story. But I think where he really excels is everything feels so real within this story. Even though it is a fantasy story, it feels so real. I guess it becomes, surreal. It sort of goes beyond feeling real. But I think it feels so real in the detail. It's so incredibly rich and fleshed out, and the detail is just so incredibly vivid. And, I remember in the first book, there's a sword fight, and like every sword stroke is a paragraph long, because it's just so incredibly fleshed out and detailed. And that might sound quite tedious to be reading a story where it feels probably like it's then quite slow, but it reads really well. That's a completely separate thing. But I guess what I'm trying to say is it feels still incredibly hidden, and there's so much of this book that is still shrouded in mystery. And because Gormenghast, this vast castle, is painted as this vast, sort of almost endless castle, you feel like even though you've got these pages and pages of detailing Gormenghast and the rituals and the people within, you still feel like you're barely scratching the surface, because it feels like the characters are barely scratching the surface. They kind of, they find their little pockets of this castle to exist in, and the rest of the castle is almost like this just crumbling vestige that's falling down around them. And so it's just because of that, you just get this ethereal sense of like, I have so much detail and I know exactly what's going on and I know what's in front of me, but I feel like I just can't grasp this castle. It's like grasping smoke. And I think that's sort of the main beauty of it, is you feel like you get to sort of peek behind the curtain, but you never get to fully see what's there. And that is just, I think it's a really difficult thing to do, to write, at this stage, 1,000 pages detailing this story, nothing's really happened in terms of plot, and still there's mystery that is keeping us going as the readers, that keep us engaged and really, really happy to keep reading this almost meaningless story. And I'm not saying that in a way that there's no meaning within the story, but I mean, it's just a wonderful skill, and I really noticed that, and I absolutely loved it. Something I don't think I mentioned in the first episode, the Titus Grown episode, was that Mervyn Peake was actually an artist, or continued to be an artist throughout his life. And I think I mentioned that he was an artist, but I forgot to mention that within the stories, he's actually put his own sketches. And I saw someone saying they don't really like sketches in adult books like this, but I think, if you're an accomplished artist and you've sort of got a vision for the story, like I said with the Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell book as well, it's actually so nice to get little images just out of nowhere, out of the blue. It's not necessarily an exciting scene or an important scene, but there's a scene that just suddenly gets an image attached to it, and you kind of wonder, why that scene? What's that for? Why did you draw that? And apparently these stories, I read somewhere that these images that Mervyn Peake actually sketched weren't sort of like official images, I guess, in that he didn't sort of sit down to sketch them out, but he'd actually just sketch them in the margins and stuff like that, which is really, really cool. So he was obviously, just hit like a writer's block and was like, I'm just going to sketch for a minute and see what comes to me. And so he just sketched these scenes, and they're just sort of littered throughout the book. And I absolutely love it, because it's just so nice to get. It's so nice to get, especially when you're a very accomplished artist like Mervyn Peake, and you can fully see the world through your words, but you can also visualize it and imprint that upon the world through art as well. I think to get his images along with the story are really special, because they do sort of add that personality to the story as well. So I said this story is a bit darker than the first one. I think that's just because Titus is grown up now, and he's sort of becoming restless within himself, within the castle, and he starts to explore the world a bit further. And I guess the darkness, there's sort of darkness from Steerpike, and I'll talk about that in a second, but I think the darkness for Titus's storyline comes from sort of the vast unknown, and he's sort of stepping out the bounds of the castle and his duties, and it's kind of this unknown sense of what's going to happen. And because we don't really know the story that well, we don't really know the world that well, the world that Gormenghast is situated in, I think that sort of creates some of the tension, because as he leaves the castle and we get to see the outside world or the surrounding sort of forest, we don't really know what's out there, and we don't know what kind of fantasy world this is. We don't know if there's, the fantasy world is littered with 1,000,000 dragons that hunt you down the second you leave or anything like that. So I guess there's sort of that element of, again, it's not fully knowing the whole picture that creates this tension that's just beautiful throughout. And then, of course, Steerpike as well. He's still going on. He sort of had a little success in the first story, but he sort of continues on this almost war path of trying to gain power. And he's a really interesting storyline. I think he's really utilized well in this story to create a really nice tension throughout the story as he tries to attain this power. And without him, this story might have fallen flat on its head, because he's a really good villain in that he befriends a lot of people, and he sort of is always there to save the day. But then, it's kind of like someone starts to notice within this story, the Doctor starts to notice that he always seems to save the day, and it always seems to benefit him, and he always then seems to jump up a rung on this ladder and sort of jump up a rung in people's minds as well. And he's always there, and he's always saving people. And it's just this really beautiful story of sort of like what it takes to, I guess, gain power in that way, in this slow, methodical sense of trying to gain power, and the steps you have to make, the real kind of chess, not checkers moves you have to make. And It's not always about wars and swords of conquest and just absolute domination by force, but it can be these really small, subtle moves of, taking your time and progressing through the story that way. So I really enjoyed Steerpike. I thought he was, an absolutely fantastic villain and really sort of helped balance this story as well. The characters through this story, there's a widening of characters. There's more characters than in the first story, but again, it's just, they're all just so wacky and wonderful that you absolutely fall in love with all of them. There's sort of, the three storylines going on in this story are sort of Titus becoming restless with the ceremony, Steerpike trying to gain power, and then there's the doctor's sister who's trying to find a husband. And it's kind of like this really light comical story that balances these other two quite darker sides of the story. And she's just trying to find a husband and organize this party to bring suitors in to try find a husband. And it's just the most absurd thing in the world. And it goes on for pages and pages. And you get in, like, there was one stage where she's trying to arrange this party and it's like 10 pages long. And after 10 pages, she's like, what am I reading? Like, what's actually happened? Nothing's happened. But I'm so engaged. I'm so much enjoying this story and I don't really get it, but I'm here and I'm having a good time. So, I thought it was a fantastic book. I don't really have anything else to say without sort of spoiling more of the story. I will say it ends perfectly. The last sort of 50 pages are really beautifully written and really sort of, cap off the story in a whole and really make it a worthy investment of a story. And I also think it works. It ends really well. The first one sort of ended in a way that it was like, well, I could stop here if I wanted to, but this one ends pretty much on a cliffhanger that really makes you want to jump into part three. Part 3 is a bit shorter, which, I'm sad about, but I'm not too sad about because I've got some other big reads on the horizon. But in terms of like the pure beauty of Gormenghast and Mervyn Peake's writing, I am quite sad. This one's pretty much half the size, 250 pages, and I'm very much excited to get into that. So Mervyn Peake's Gormenghast, what would I rate this out of 5? The beauty of the language, I think it's just going to be a 4.2, maybe even a 4.3, because it was fantastic. It's beautiful. It captures, Titus growing up and sort of going through the natural change of growing up and becoming an adult, the transition from childhood to adolescence to adult. It goes through all of that, I think, perfectly. There's beautiful themes running throughout. It's well written. I got to stop singing its praises. I've sung them enough. Mervyn Peake's Gormenghast. Check it out if you want. Okay, so what was I reading this week? This week I've started reading The Dark King Swallows the World by Robert G. Penner. This book is epic. This is so much fun. I was sort of entering, I thought, like a bit of a reading slump after finishing the last book, just because it was such a dark, heavy book. I haven't mentioned what that book is yet. Not Gormenghast. I absolutely loved Gormenghast. This other book that I'm doing an episode on. It was just such like a dark, really heavy, hectic story that I was kind of like, whoa, I feel tired. Jumping into this has been a savior because this is such a fun story. It's about this 12-year-old girl who's sort of shipped off to Cornwall in the UK, and her stepbrother dies, and she's now got to travel to the underworld to try save him. It's sort of this like youthful coming of age story, blending the mythology of English history with some more very adult themes. It's absolutely fantastic. It's just a lot of fun and it's completely fresh and enjoyable. And it's a fantasy book in one as well, which I absolutely love because they're very much undersold. So The Dark King Swallows the World. I love the color. I love the mixing of the blues and blacks. No idea where it's kind of going. Well, I kind of know where the story itself is going. I shouldn't say that, but I'm really excited to get there. It's just so much fun to read. And I do say it's a coming of age story, but it does still have very adult characters in here doing very adult things, having some very adult conversations, discussing politics and philosophy and all these things. So it doesn't feel like I'm reading a children's book. It feels like I'm very much reading an adult book with a child as the main character, which is very cool. So yeah, The Dark King Swallows the World. Check it out if you are interested. Thank you so much for listening. If you have listened this far, please consider hitting the duck in the corner or clicking 5 stars. I would greatly appreciate that. But as always, just thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for making it to the end, and I hope you have a really good day. So today, to take us away, the opening quote from The Dark King Swallows the World, and it reads like this. After the first death, there is no other.